The first important thing in the extractive industry is, of course, to understand what is the nature of extractive industry itself. Yeah. In terms of exploration, exploitation, and also the production. From that case, we can understand what we need to explore, what we need to exploit, what we need to product to make the raw material become the end product. And then if we understand that process, we can calculate all the costs, all the risks, and all. Maybe if we can also calculate the revenue what we will get, and then by that we can see and understand how is the risk, how is the cost, and especially for extractive industry, one of the special things is that extractive industry is high risk and high cost. So that's what the important things that we need to know first, because before we assess the process of extractive industry, not only technical matter, but also the economical and social matter related with that. So important within this process is first, of course, to know the characteristic, what we handle, what extractive industry we handle, whether we see or we assess the extractive industry, oil and gas, or we talk about coal, or we talk about mineral, and then in which area we talk about. Is it in a metro area? Is it a very rural area, in a new area? Because all of this will give a different impact on the calculation of risk and cost, and also later on the revenue that we will get. So that I think that aspect should be considered by all of the people who want to assess the extractive industry and to assess the process of the governance within the extractive industry.
So when you want to understand what extractive industry is, you have to put it in the context of energy. What is energy? How do you want to manage energy? So you have to make energy available. You have to make energy sustainable. You have to make energy affordable. You have to make energy environment friendly. You have to make energy with the participation of the society. And you have to make energy for poverty eradication. How do you do that? To do that, the extractive industry must be managed on the basis of good corporate governance and transparency. That is the message I conveyed during my presentation. How do my presentation, what are my suggestions for policy reforms, is that if the country wants to make policy reforms in the field of transparency, everybody has to have a same understanding of what the Constitution says on the management of natural resources. This all boils down to have a common understanding of what Article 33 of the Indonesian Constitution says.
In our session, we talked about the legal framework governing extractive industries and some of the key concerns that the participants in the course should have when they're assessing the legal framework in their country, seeing if it sets up the best system for converting extractive industries into development, and in particular, monitoring the enforcement of legal obligations, including extractive industry contracts. So one of the major things that we talked about in the session was thinking about how all of the different pieces of the legal framework fit together. We looked at how extractive industries are governed in the Constitution, how they're governed in legislation, regulation, and then we spent a particular amount of time on contracts in the extractive industries. The contract system in many countries is one that is really extensive. So it's not unusual to have an extractive industry contract that may deviate from the law of the land and that might be hundreds of pages with very complex difficult to understand and difficult to enforce sorts of mechanisms. So we spent a lot of our time in the session talking through what are the typical features of extractive industry contracts. And as a participant is analyzing a contract, what should that participant think about as he or she is considering how to assess whether the contract is in the country's best interest and how to make sure it's being enforced moving forward. So the last thing that we spent a lot of time on was really trying to give some practical experience to the participants in terms of really digging into legal texts, thinking about what they might mean, and coming up with a plan for how to use and analyze these texts as part of an advocacy campaign or as part of the participant's role as a government official or journalist.
In the training, I have two main ideas that I would like to tell to the participant of the training. The first is about the oil and gas fiscal system, and the second is about the way we choose the best fiscal system for a country. In the first idea, I would like to explain to the participant of the training, before assessing or analyzing the fiscal system in oil and gas industry, we do realize, or we should realize, there are something that should be considered, such as the condition of the economy in one country, and the second is about the investment climate in the country, and the third is about what people need or what people ask to do, for what people ask the government to do. So before analyzing, assessing the fiscal system, those factors are very important to be considered. Everything relates to the fiscal system should be connected with the economic condition as well as the political condition in one country. The fiscal system is only the system that manages the way the government get the revenue. But the principle behind that is why the government need the revenue. That's the reason behind why we should understand some important things before assessing the fiscal system itself. And for the second main idea, when we choose the best fiscal system in one country, we can conclude that there is no best, or there is no best fiscal regime for every country in the world. So the thing that the country should do is to decide to choose the stable and flexible fiscal terms for its fiscal regime system in the country. The meaning of the stable and flexible fiscal system doesn't mean the system can be changed based on the short-term needs. The meaning of the stable and flexible fiscal system is the way the government can adjust the fiscal terms based on the current condition in geological and geophysical condition in the country, and also the current condition in the world economy in terms of the increase or decline of oil prices, and also the current condition of the working area, the field area for oil and gas industry. By not considering at least those three conditions, it's impossible for the government to get more benefit from the oil and gas industry, and in general for the extractive industries. That's the main idea of my session in this training. Thank you very much.
Well, yes, the most important message or takeaway from my session in this course is that there will always be environmental and social impacts in extractive industries. We have to know them, and we have to address them and mitigate them. If they cannot be addressed or mitigated, the project should not even happen. But if we know them, we identify them, we should identify solutions, so no longer will we have those environmental and social impacts in a way that they cannot be managed. For me, the most important aspect or part of this, of the policy part of this, the most important policy reform necessary from my view is getting to have really institutionalized into policy and into legislation. A good environmental impact assessment, good free and prior informed consent processes into making a decision about mining, oil and gas and other extractive industries. That's really important to get it right, to get it clear in the law. It's mandatory to get it clear in the law what are the standards, like the precautionary principle that can be applied, to get it into the law that there is public participation and access to information to get this also right. Then I think we can do extractive industries properly with that.
Well, in the sessions, I continue the point which already raised by Professor Tony Lavigna in the previous sessions, in that reforms on extractive industries required a good understanding on standard, required a good understanding on how to bring about participations in politically sensible way, and eventually the knowledge, the willingness and the commitment to take part in reform will improve the accountability of governance on extractive industry. So my session basically is to collect the knowledge of the participants from different settings and come up to an agreement on the key issues, key aspect of environmental and more especially on the social impact assessment that those who engage in the reform should be enhancing it. Now, the governance in each country are different, and then the setup of the countries are unique, but yet there are political framework in which engagement of civil society and business and government officers in dealing with extractive industries are still subject to negotiations, and the willingness to improve from each side will eventually contribute to better governance on extractive industry. The sessions will also drive the need to define civil society's contributions on policy reform. And the policy reform, as I discussed with the student in the class, require what I call concerted action from broad range of civil society engagement, which also involve good networking from various segments of civil society and beyond, and more importantly, to establish think tank to counterfact the claim from the business, to challenge the inappropriate decision from the government and so forth, and the need for developing broad range of collective endeavor for making a think tank within the network becomes supporting system for political activism in extractive industry. So to make sure that civil society activists be able to push for the reform requires not only managerial understanding, like making good deal, understanding how to make document on extractive industry, like environmental impact assessment and so forth, but we want to, so to speak, politicize so that the knowledge on extractive industry will be useful in pushing specific reform in respecting countries. So reform in this regard shall be negotiated with collective engagements and the power of knowledge from the side of community and activists. Thank you.
So I cover revenue management, revenue distribution. We ask a few different questions. We ask, what are the major challenges that countries face and resource-rich governments face in managing volatile, finite, and sometimes very large natural resource revenues. So we look at a few different things. We look at sovereign wealth funds. We look at revenue sharing regimes, so tax assignments to local governments and intergovernmental transfers to local governments. And we look at macroeconomic policy more generally. Fiscal rules, macroeconomic frameworks, and what are the different policies that a government can put in place to address some very serious issues. Those issues can be Dutch disease, they can be revenue and expenditure volatility that leads to very bad spending decisions, and it can also lead to and other issues. What do you do when oil or gas or mineral revenues run out? How do you plan in advance? How do you create a national development plan? And how do you invest for the future rather than just consume for today? The policy implications and the opportunities for reform differ depending on the country. Myanmar is in a very different situation than Indonesia, than Timor-Leste and the Philippines. Philippines has very few natural resource revenues compared to some of the other countries in the region, but they have very significant governance issues at a local level, from monitoring the value of minerals being extracted to actually providing benefits for local communities. In Myanmar, there's a big debate right now around resource revenue sharing. So we spoke a little bit about what are the different policies that Myanmar can put in place to share resource revenues with the producing regions and states. And here in Indonesia, there is already a revenue sharing system in place, but the challenge again is how to have some districts that don't receive revenues but that physically sit on top of the oil actually benefit as well. So the implications for the type of the subjects that we're talking about are really depend on the country, but almost in every case, one of the big challenges we face and one of the things that we're trying to address is how to build consensus among the major stakeholders, government, civil society, media, parliaments on what rules should be in place to manage and distribute oil, mineral, and gas revenues, and then how to actually make sure that the rules are being followed.
Today I facilitated 2 sessions. The first one is on the basic principles of public finance, and the focus of that is really identifying and clarifying the different stages of the budgeting process and the value of taxation and why taxation is unique in the sector of extractive industry. We also tried to identify areas where civil society can participate to make the budgeting process more transparent and accountable. The second session is actually focus on pulling together everything that they've learned so far in the past few days and helping different stakeholders frame the policy agenda with respect to the extractive sector and what paradigm to adopt given the political, social, and economic context of a country.
Our session, which runs for 1.5 days, is about coalition for reform, the modalities of collective action for policy change in the extractive industry. There are 3 areas in which this session covers. One deals with policy improvement, and we ask a question: how can coalitions or different forms of alliances among civil society and other interest groups become effective in shaping the policy options as well as the policy agenda? The second area that this session tackles is about strategic engagement. This session asks, considering that there are different players or actors that can in part drive the governance of the extractive industry, how can coalitions or NGOs effectively engage with these different players with overlapping interests or competing interests and complex relationship in a way that will result in advancing their policy reform agenda. And the third one is it's about communicating their policy position. You know, it's important for participants, and many participants know that it is not enough to just be good at analyzing problem or problem diagnosis. It's also important for them to also communicate effectively their policy proposition. So in this particular session, we will learn from our experience from everyone about good practices or tips about how to communicate effectively your policy message using different tools. It could be in the form of direct lobbying with the legislators or people at the executive branch. It can be in the form of how to effectively communicate your policy proposal in multi-stakeholder platforms. It's also about how to effectively communicate your policy position using media, including, you know, when you develop a press statement or when you develop an open letter. So these are the three areas that this 1.5 day session covers. Why is it important? This is a particularly important session in the sense that it reintroduces the participants about the skills and practicalities when it comes to linking their policy analysis into policy action. You know, we did our mapping about the participants' home countries, and it turns out that participants from Myanmar are currently engaged in the reform of their legal framework, either for oil and gas or in mining law. In Indonesia, participants are quite engaged in a different vantage points about the revision of the oil and gas law as well as in the mining law, and this happened to be among the extractive policies that are in the policy reform agenda priority of President Jokowi. The same situation applies to the Philippines, where Philippines are now embarking on getting a fiscal bill which will complement the mining law in the Philippines. And a lot of this would require those kinds of competencies, if you like, or knowledge, skills, and attitudes when it comes to strategic engagement, when it comes to understanding, and what are the considerations you need to look at when intervening or shaping the policy change, as well as in communicating messages. So what makes this session different from the earlier days is there's no theory. This is more of an embodiment or reflection of some of the good practices that have been learned over time by colleagues in the field, including myself.
Okay. So the principal idea behind this training on EITI is to give opportunity for participants, civil society, from the government and also from the companies to see the possibility for using this tool to reform in their own respective countries. So the presentation is covering the key policy areas in the EITI standard, but also we discuss critically the pros and cons of the EITI and what the participants can do to improve the EITI in their countries if they already become a member of, if they have interest to join this initiative. The most important part of the session to promote policy reform in the countries is, I think, is during the working group, when each country, they come up with their own analysis about what are the governance challenges in their own countries, analyzing the recommendations, coming up with the solutions and the actions that they are going to take after the course. I think that is one of the most important part of the session that could help the participants to think through critically about what they should do after the course. Thanks.